Hi, I'm Tony Northrup, and a couple of days ago I published a video about crop factor that was designed to help people achieve similar results with cameras that have different sized sensors. So I showed you how to apply the crop factor not only to the focal length, which is pretty commonly understood, but also to the aperture, as well as the crop factor squared to the ISO. And this allows you to get exactly the same beautiful pictures with smaller format cameras like APS-C cameras and Micro Four Thirds cameras that you can get with full frame cameras, provided you can find similar lenses. The response was just overwhelming, and more than 90% of people were thrilled to see this information. Many people were really happy about it, but a small portion of the people were pretty unhappy about it, and some of them got pretty vocal, and some of them even got kind of emotional. Well, emotions aside, I want to go through and address their concerns, because most of their concerns fall into a couple of different categories. So to represent all those hundreds of commenters who had negative things to say, I've gotten one of them, a friend named Ron, who's in Pensacola, to apply his own thoughts and read some comments from other reviewers. So let's go over to Ron, who's here with a satellite feed.
Hi, I'm Ron. I'm 48 years young, and I've been shooting since before you were born. And I just don't like this Tony Northrup guy. He's like the dairy. He just doesn't sit with me right. And I'm not just the only one. Like, you could go on the internets and people are outraged by what this guy is teaching. It's like, he thinks he's like the Gandhi of photography or something. Get out, Tony Northrup. You're not wanted. So, let me read a few comments from people, and, everybody's outraged. All right, this first one, it starts out, what a crack of shit, says Aaron Weiss. I checked out when you got through 13 minutes of ISO demos without mentioning pixel density or disclosing the pixel counts of the sensors you used in the demo. Your equation makes zero logical sense, and it doesn't account for pixel density. And Aaron, you're absolutely right. I mean, pixel density is everything. So for Tony Northrup not to address it, stupid. He's stupid and I don't like him. So I agree with you, Tony Northrup, wrong and stupid.
Ron, hold on. Okay, thanks, Ron. So let's talk a little bit about pixel density. That Ron is an opinionated fella. Higher megapixel cameras have a higher pixel density than lower megapixel cameras. If you have a 24 megapixel APS-C camera and an 18 megapixel APS-C camera, of course the 24 megapixel camera has to cram more pixels in there. And what that means is that each pixel gets less light. And the end result of this is that if you compare 10 by 10 grid of pixels from a high megapixel camera to a low megapixel camera, the high megapixel camera seems much noisier because each pixel in the high density camera is getting less light. And so a lot of people got hung up about this, but in fact I don't mention pixels anywhere in that 40-minute video because they were completely irrelevant. What is relevant, however, is total image noise, and that's the amount of noise that the entire sensor gathers. And this is exactly the same for high megapixel cameras and low megapixel cameras and film and your human eye, an A7R or an A7S. It's all equivalent. So let's look at some sample pictures. I have some new data here to share. So on the left here we have an 18 megapixel APS-C sensor at ISO 1600, and on the right we have a 24 megapixel APS-C sensor also at ISO 1600. So exactly the same settings. And what you see is that the left looks far better, right? The right side looks so much noisier. And that's because the left side, the pixels are bigger. And we're comparing them on a 1 pixel to 1 pixel basis. So I took, like a 120 pixel grid from the center and compared it against a 120 pixel grid from this side here. There's a problem though. By counting individual pixels, I ended up taking a smaller portion of the 24 megapixel picture, and that means that that portion of the sensor was getting less light. It's also, well, we don't live in an 8-bit like Super Mario Brothers world where where we see each individual pixel, right? We don't compare pictures 1 pixel to 1 pixel. What we do instead is we take all the pixels that we have in our picture and we scale it to a given size, which is our smartphone screen or an 8x10 print or whatever. So we're always scaling all the pixels we have to the same viewing size, and that means pixels get pushed together and blended together. So let's look at another picture. Here, I've taken that 24 megapixel sensor, I've taken the same portion of the sensor and scaled it to the same resolution. So this compares total image noise in the same way that we typically view pictures. And if you look at these two now, they look much more similar. That's because we're looking at the same portion of the sensor, the same portion of the total picture. Now, you might even think this 24 megapixel sensor here is now a little bit cleaner. I think, to my eye, it is a little bit cleaner. It's not much, but it's just a hair. That can be explained in a couple of different ways. For one, this is a nice Sony sensor, and that's a Canon sensor, and Sony actually has a hair better technology. But this is also 1.5x, and that's a 1.6x crop because it's a Canon sensor. So the sensor sizes are a little bit different. So this actually gathered a little more light, and maybe they have the edge on technology a little bit. But this is counterintuitive to all the people who said that it's all about pixel density, because they're saying higher pixel densities mean more noise. And here we see, in this example of real world example, here the higher pixel density actually resulted in less total image noise. But for the most part, the theory does hold up, and it's kind of a wash. I want to read a quote from a commenter about pixel density. I think if you do 100% pixel peeping, then higher megapixel images will be noisier due to smaller pixel size. But when you are viewing the images at full screen, many of these smaller pixels will fuse together to form a bigger pixel on the screen. And now the sensor size plays a lot bigger role on the overall noise of the image. Of course, this is comparing similar sensor technology. And this person paid attention in the video. Thank you. That's all I could really ask for, and I appreciate you watching the video and following it. And I think they're absolutely right. The megapixels, it's kind of a wash. Now, higher megapixels will give you more detail, but that doesn't necessarily change the total image noise in any way. So let's go back to Ron and hear his next comment.
All right, our next comment is from Ron. I can tell you're a Canon and Nikon fanboy, says Ron. Something is wrong in how you explain things. I agree, he's wrong. Just explaining things, he's just so wrong. It's so sad, he says. And Ron, you summed it up, Rodham. He's so sad. He needs to just beat it. We're all tired of him. Okay.
Wait, Ron. Okay, Ron, first, nice shirt. And you do have a good point about Canon and Nikon. Now, people said I was a Canon Nikon fanboy, or that I was being paid by Canon and Nikon, because in the first video, I laid out all these examples where Sony, Olympus, Panasonic, and even Fuji abused people's misunderstanding of ISO, aperture, and crop factor in order to sell them products that they ultimately might not be happy with. And then I said I couldn't find examples of Canon and Nikon doing this. And then probably like within an hour, people sent me like a list of examples where Canon and Nikon were equally evil. So I appreciate this. First, you're saying you kind of agree that it's wrong. You just don't agree with the fact that I omitted a couple of companies. And sure enough, there were valid examples that I just hadn't found. The reason I hadn't found them is Canon and Nikon aren't quite as malicious. They aren't quite as obvious in the way they do it. But let's look at this Canon PowerShot G1X here in a quote from them. It offers a 5x zoom factor with a 24 to 120 millimeter equivalent range, and it has an incredibly bright aperture of f2.0 and an angle, and f3.9 fully zoomed. So that's bad. You can't apply the crop factor to the focal length and not apply it to the aperture, because as I said in my first video, you break math. Aperture and focal length are inherently and mathematically linked. Let's take a look at Nikon. I think this is a P7800. Their superior optics maintain image brightness throughout the zoom range from f2 at 28 millimeters to f4 at 200 millimeters telephoto. They have the balls to put a little asterisk there, because that asterisk says 35 millimeter equivalent. But of course they only applied the 35 millimeter equivalent to the focal length and not to the aperture. So that's misleading. It's really misleading, because there's no way that this is a 200 millimeter f4 35 millimeter equivalent lens. It doesn't gather nearly as much light. So this is bad by Canon and Nikon. But let's go back and take a look at what Olympus did. Now, not only that, Canon and Nikon kind of buried it in the description. So if you're really digging deep, you might be misled. What Olympus did is they took a picture of their little camera and they put the shadow of a 300 millimeter f2.8 lens there. So they're trying to make you think that this camera would take the same pictures as this big camera visually. And then the description of the camera itself is 28 to 300 millimeter f2.8. It's not. It's a 6 to 64 millimeter f2.8. And if you feel like you need to put it in 35 millimeter terms, it becomes a 28 to 300 millimeter f13. But there's no way that it's a 300 millimeter f2.8, and you can see why, because that's what a 300 millimeter f2.8 has to look like. It has to have this opening front element. And to review again, the Panasonic FC200, 4.5 to 108 millimeter f2.8. If you put it in 35 millimeter equivalence terms, it becomes a 25 to 600 millimeter f16. F16 is a pretty small aperture, but right here on the lens, they write 25 to 600 millimeter f2.8. They write it right on the lens, and they use a big type. So I think this is like next level evil, because I believe that this means that Panasonic, before they had their engineers begin working on it, I believe they designed these optics with the assumption that people would apply the focal length, the crop factor, to the focal length, but not the aperture, which of course is not mathematically a valid approach to it. So they know that people misunderstand this, and they designed a lens so that the numbers came out to be even 35 millimeter numbers that people would want. Because these aren't even numbers. They usually would have, maybe they would have called it an f5 to f100 millimeter lens, but clearly this camera only makes sense if you put it into 35 millimeter terms, but you forget to apply it to the aperture. All right, so let's go back to Ron in Pensacola and see what he has to say.
Okay, next comment is from Carlos. You discovered gunpowder. See, this one confused me because I was like, this Tony guy, he looks kind of old, but gunpowder's pretty old, but this isn't literal here. He's just saying like, it's been done, you know? The only positive thing about this video is showing a vague minds, what anyone with minimum technical knowledge already knew. And he's pretty much saying, to sum it up, Tony Northrup is stupid, which is what I've been saying all along. I've been saying it since day one. He's stupid. This last
Okay, hold on a second, Ron. This is a funny argument because they're saying this is so obvious that everybody knows this already. And it's funny that they're mad because they're totally agreeing with me. They're just irritated that I'm wasting their time by saying something that everybody has known for some time that is factually true. And in fact, there is a big body of people out there who have already kind of gone through this, but it seems to me that there's a massive group of people who don't already know this and maybe don't understand the implications of it. And based on all the other feedback from people who were thrilled to learn it or who disagreed, it doesn't seem like it's all that obvious, but thanks at least for agreeing with me, I guess. Let's go read the next comment from Ron.
This last comment is from Godfrey. That's a good name. This whole video is no more than the same tired horse pucky, that's a good word, that I've seen promulgated on sites like DPR Review for a decade. No one should watch this whole thing unless they really like watching paint dry and debating how many angels can sit on the head of a pin. Waste of time. Completely agree with you, Godfrey. Like I said, I just don't like this Tony Northrup guy, and that's it.
Okay, thanks, Ron. I don't know if that comment had any new material in it, but I loved horse pucky and paint drying and putting angels on the head of a pin. Now, Ron seemed fed up with me, but I would like to go over a few more comments. The guy who runs the Mirrorless Rumor site said I was wrong, and then he cited this article. The only evidence he really cited was this article that somebody else wrote on an Admiring Light website. So here's a quick link you can type to take you there, sdp.io/al. And I want to go over a couple of points that guy makes in the article, because I read the article and I thought, this guy and I totally agree. And in fact, I thought this guy is my nerd, because he nailed all of the math, all of his math added up with mine perfectly, and then he said, the only thing he said against me was he said, well, but it doesn't really matter because I know how to use the lenses for what they are, even though the smaller sensor requires some compensation for the ISO and aperture producing different results. And that was exactly the point of my video. But I think if you don't watch the whole thing, if you skim it, or if you don't understand it fully, you might think we disagreed with each other, but everything he says completely supports what I said. So let's go over some of the points. This is a quote from the article. Since micro four thirds has a crop factor of 2, 25 millimeter becomes a 50 millimeter lens for the same field of view, and f1.4 becomes f2.8 for the same depth of field. Similarly, 25mm f1.4 and 50mm f2.8 have the same amount of background blur at the same focus distance. So that's exactly what I said about applying the crop factor to the aperture to understand depth of field. Here he goes on about the light. A full frame sensor is 4 times larger in area than a micro four thirds sensor. Therefore, if the f-stop is the same, then thus the intensity of the light is the same. He's talking about light gathered per square inch, not total light gathered. And the exposure is the same because, as we showed, that the same settings achieve the same exposure, the same brightness. Then the full frame camera will be using 4 times the total amount of light to make the image because it's got 4 times the total area. Sound familiar from the other video, right? For the smaller sensor to have the same total amount of light, they need 2 stops faster aperture or 2 stops lower ISO with a longer shutter speed. So he's talking about micro four thirds, which has a 2x crop factor. I introduced the fact that you can apply this to other crop factors simply by squaring the crop factor. So if you have a 1.5x APS-C sensor, you square it to 2.25x and use that to determine the equivalent ISO. So far he has successfully validated all the mathematical principles of my video. Go on to the next quote. However, full frame sensors measure roughly 1 2/3 stops better in ISO performance than MFT. So here he's saying that in practice it differs a little bit from the theory. Instead of being 2 full stops, it adds up to 1 2/3 stops. What he did was he went to DxOMark, a website that I really like if you are into that kind of technical nitty-gritty stuff, and he compared the EM5 to the Nikon D600 and the 5D Mark III. And that's the number that he came up with. So I feel like that's actually pretty close. My video did not get into sensor technologies, it was theoretical. So I think if my theory says the light difference is going to be 2 stops and the measured implementation of it turns out to be 1 2/3 stops, that's about a 16% difference. So I think that's pretty accurate. But I noticed that the author happened to use the very worst full frame cameras. So I wanted to repeat the process with kind of the best cameras from each segment. And just as a reminder, this is where my numbers come from. APS-C sensors have a 1.5x crop because they're smaller. Therefore, small buckets gather less rain than a big bucket, right? ISO measures light per square inch, not total light gathered. Micro four thirds is a 2x crop. But let's go on to see how the difference is measured in practice when I compared the very best that full frame, micro four thirds, and APS-C sensors have to offer. So what I did was I took DxOMark's ISO rating for each of the cameras, and I worked backwards to determine what the sensor's crop factor would be based totally on their ISO measurements. So in science, this is a good thing to do. To come up with a theory, you want to validate it by taking actual measurements. So here a third party who's well respected has taken these actual measurements. I'm taking my formulas and I'm working backwards from their measurements to calculate what the sensor's crop factor would be. So the commonly accepted standard for APS-C is a 1.5x crop. I calculated what the crop should be based on the ISO and the light gathered, and it ended up being 1.487x. Which is very, very close to 1.5x. And in fact, if I had rounded it more, it would have been exactly 1.5x, but I wanted to be as accurate as possible. For the micro four thirds sensor, my calculation ended up determining that it would be a 1.984x crop factor. And of course, full frame comes out to 1 because this is the standard that I use. That's the constant. So this adds up to a 0.8% difference between my theory and implementation. And that's about as small as you're gonna possibly get, right? So I think the theory does hold up pretty well. So I wanted to address all those people who said, okay, your theory and your math are sound, but it doesn't work out that way because, micro four thirds sensors, the light gathering ability is so much more efficient or something else. It doesn't seem like it. It seems like 99.2% of it is determined by simply the total amount of light gathered. And that's what our sensors need, including our micro four thirds sensors, more light. So let's move on. Another common argument I heard was, I use micro four thirds because I want the extra depth of field. I just want to point out that the flip side to my argument is that you can get the same depth of field with a full frame camera. So you don't need to be changing formats or sensors just because you want more depth of field. You just apply the crop factor to your aperture on full frame and you'll get the same depth of field. It works both ways. Now say that if you're shooting full frame and you're always shooting at f11 and ISO 800, then you can go to micro four thirds and shoot at f5.6 and ISO 200 and know that you can get the exact same results in a much smaller package. So if you're always using high f-stops, then you can get away with micro four thirds and you don't have to worry about finding really fast lenses that might not be currently available. So let's move on to the next point. Another, I don't even want to say who it is because his argument wasn't especially valid, but another person who runs an important blog put up a little test, and he said, take a picture with a full frame A7 and then take a picture with an APS-C Sony A6000 using the same settings. And if you get the same brightness picture, then Tony is wrong. And to me, this is exactly like in the OJ trial when they said, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Like you put up kind of a test that has nothing to do with anything and then said I must be wrong. And then of course, people who didn't process all the information for themselves, they might look at the test and be like, Tony must be wrong. But in the video, in several different places, I demonstrate that if you use the same settings on different size sensors, then you get pictures of the same brightness. Here's just one of those examples. These were taken on a full frame and an MFT using the same exact settings and you get the same brightness. This was an important prerequisite to understanding the rest of my video. It's part of my premise. And he said, if this is what happens, then I must be wrong. But no, you have to understand that this is how cameras work before you can understand the rest of it. So let's move on to the next argument I heard all the time, which is f2.8 is f2.8 is f2.8. Well, okay, but no, it's not. It's f2.8 is f2.8 as far as light gathered per square unit of area, per square inch, for example. But if you change the sensor size, then you're not gathering as much light and you're also not getting the same depth of field. And the aperture really only determines, as far as your picture quality goes, the depth of field and the total light gathered. So every aspect of what your aperture does changes. So f2.8 is not f2.8. And here's just one example. Pictures taken with full frame and micro four thirds cameras. You can see the background here is very blurry on the full frame camera. It's much more in focus on the micro four thirds camera. This is a slide from my previous video, so I'm not going to go into detail about it. Watch that other video first. But no, it's just not the same thing. Another common argument I heard is the medium format argument. And these people said, well, what about medium format? All the 35mm manufacturers must be cheating everybody because they're not putting stuff in medium format terms. This argument makes no sense to me whatsoever because no manufacturer puts things in medium format. But if they did, if people were putting full frame cameras into medium format terms but not converting the aperture, then I would say they were cheating, but I can't find a single example of that ever happening. So it's not biased for 35mm full frame. The only reason I use that as a point of reference is that that's what everybody uses as a point of reference. All those products were converted into 35mm terms. It wasn't me making that up, it's the camera manufacturers who are doing that. Here's another comment that I think is totally valid. This person says, from a personal perspective, I would heed caution to insinuate that every user wants the same picture from different sensor formats. We don't. And I couldn't agree more. And it's not my intention to insinuate this, but some people do want to compare. For example, I have a book, Stunning Digital Photography, and for many of my pictures, I'll tell you the camera settings so that if you like the look of it, maybe the shallow depth of field, or maybe you just like the wide angle of it, you can grab your own camera and put those same settings in. But so many people have different size sensors that they need to be able to convert back and forth. And that's the point of using crop factor, just to compare. Sometimes crop factor is important if you're using full frame and you want to jump over to medium format or APS-C or micro four thirds. But it's not important to everybody. And if you don't care about crop factor, then just keep shooting and don't bother with it. But no, I don't think everybody wants shallow depth of field, but some of us need to be able to compare. So just so we don't end on a negative note, I want to read a couple of positive comments from people who seem to have actually been helped by the video. Here's one. Great video, Tony, and excellent math and explanation clarification. I'll be waiting now for Olympus, Panasonic, or other micro four thirds manufacturers to introduce the 12 to 35 or 35 to 100 f1.4 for €1,000 price tag. Me too. That's what I really hope. And I think part of the reason they aren't introducing these fast lenses is that they don't think there's a market for f1.4, but I want to be able to get the exact same portrait results as my 70-200 f2.8 on a full frame lens. And I want it in a smaller package, but nobody's offering it to me because I think people just don't know to apply it to the aperture, so they don't see the value. They can get away with making a smaller, cheaper lens and selling it for the same price because people don't do the conversion right. Another positive comment, the video on crop factor was just great. I knew most of the stuff before, but it was still awesome with all the examples. So thank you. Thanks for this, Tony. This was one of the things that never really made sense to me. This video cleared it up. I see that there are 186 people who didn't like it. I suspect they were people who got scammed. Nobody likes to be told that they didn't get what they paid for, but they shouldn't kill the messenger. So I don't think that's the case for everybody who disagreed with me, because there were some, confusing aspects, like the differences in pixel density, and there were articles that mentioned my video, but then kind of put it in the context of, oh, this guy says he's wrong. So it would be easy to assume that I was wrong if you didn't digest all of the information, but I do appreciate the feedback. Thank you so much. I thought I was being smart by multiplying the crop factor to the focal length, but I knew something wasn't quite right. Now everything makes sense, and for the first time, I feel like I am truly in control of my camera. Thank you. That is my ultimate goal, to give us control over our cameras. I'm not trying to make cameras look good or look bad. Well, I do want to kind of shame the manufacturers who abuse misunderstanding, because that's just not right. But for all of us photographers, it's all about getting the results that you want. And knowledge can help you do that. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed the video. And if you have any questions, just write a polite comment and I will try to get back to you. I've been kind of overwhelmed with comments, but as you can see, I am watching and kind of compiling things, and I will get back to you. Also, please don't forget to share this video so that the people who did write negative comments can see it and see my responses. And if you want more free videos, click subscribe. Thanks so much. Bye.